think I understood the importance of sport and friendship. And certainly for me personally, I used sport as a way of creating friends when I then moved around for the next, 10 years or so, whether that was at university or as I started to get jobs. First thing I would do would be to join the sports clubs and meet people through that. I don't think that everyone has that positive experience at their secondary school in particular. And you're right. I mean, the figures for girls, it's something like only 20% of girls after school continue to be play active sport. It just absolutely falls off a cliff. I think one of the ways of getting around that is actually understanding that sport doesn't just need to be played at school. Clearly at school, there does need to be some form of curricula. You do need to do it with the rest of your class. For the majority of children in a mixed gender school, there are boys there that may be off-putting for girls. But I think community sport actually offers a real opportunity for smaller groups, a more fun environment, and also could create a habit for life.
From Coordinate Sport, it's the Drive Phase, a show about sports founders, leaders and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Our guest on this episode is Nicola Walker, the CEO of Sported, the UK's largest network of community groups promoting fairness and creating opportunities for young people through grassroots sport and physical activity. We discuss Nicola's early career in leisure and working on groundbreaking customer loyalty schemes in the UK. We also look at the origin of Sported and her journey to becoming the CEO, and now working with over 2,600 organisations. We also discuss the support needed for community groups coming out of lockdown and into the next 12 months, as well as taking a look at digital transformation for the third sector and Nicola's take on closing the digital poverty gap. Enjoy the show. Okay, so delighted to welcome Nicola Walker, the CEO of Sported, to the show today. The UK charity is instrumental in connecting grassroots sports organisations with the communities that need them, and they're currently working with 2,600 organisations across the country. Nicola, welcome to the Drive Phase podcast.
Hi James, thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure. I think as we always do, we try and kind of get to know you a little bit better and dive in at the early stages. So one question I wanted to ask is, what's your earliest sporting memory? If we can kick off there.
Oh wow, that's a good one. Actually, probably messing around with my brother and my sister. As a family, we weren't uber sporty, but we were always active and always very competitive. So it didn't matter what the sport was, whether it was flying kites or running races or swimming, whatever it may be. I think those are probably my earliest memories.
Yeah, and in terms of obviously, because you grew up in Henley, right? Is there like a rowing connection there at all? Were you involved in that at an early age, or was that just
that's a great question.
coincidental?
I grew up just outside Reading. We moved to Henley when I was about 16, but I was pretty sporty by the time I went to sixth form college, and the head of rowing at the school there really wanted to get me into rowing. But in order to row, you had to give up everything else, and I didn't really want to do that. So
a big commitment.
Never rowed.
So yeah, I mean, you said your family wasn't so sporty, but that kind of environment was really physically active growing up. I mean, in terms of school life, what was that like as primary school, first experiences in school? And I guess that's when most of us get introduced to either switched on or switched off to sport at the early age, while teachers, PE teachers. How was your experience?
Yeah, it's true. I don't remember a great deal about sport at primary school, other than walking down to an unheated swimming pool that I think will be forever burned into my memory. But I was really lucky at secondary school. I went to an all-girls school, and I think that does help when it comes to sport, not least because it was really cool to be good at sport. And so, A, I loved doing it, but B, I don't think there were any negative associations. It always seemed to be a pretty positive.
Do you think that was down to the teaching staff, or just the school? Was it like quite a competitive school, or just sport was on high on the agenda there?
I actually don't think it was the teaching staff. I think it was the girls all enjoyed it. It just always seemed to be good fun. Team sports, lots of different opportunities to participate.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because in terms of, obviously, it's always a priority across the board at the moment. Girls in sport, keeping girls in the sport. There's quite a big drop off, obviously, going to secondary school, etc. Do you think it's changed the school, because that environment seems like really positive for sport? What do you think's changed over the years in terms of that? Was that just that it was a all-girls school and kind of a...
I think the fact it was an all-girls school did help, and certainly I think I understood the importance of sport and friendship. And certainly for me personally, I used sport as a way of creating friends when I then moved around for the next 10 years or so, whether that was at university or as I started to get jobs. First thing I would do would be to join the sports clubs and meet people through that. I don't think that everyone has that positive experience at their secondary school in particular. And you're right. I mean, the figures for girls, it's something like only 20% of girls after school continue to be play active sport. It just absolutely falls off a cliff. I think one one of the ways of getting around that is actually understanding that sport doesn't just need to be played at school. Clearly at school there does need to be some form of curricula. You do need to do it with the rest of your class. For the majority of children in a mixed gender school, there are boys there that may be off-putting for girls. But I think community sport actually offers a real opportunity for smaller groups, a more fun environment, and also could create a habit for life. So if I could wave one wand, not only would it, clearly I'd like to see sport better taught at all schools, as I know that many are already doing, but also that connection between school and community groups was created, because it's the community groups that then would keep girls into sport once they'd left their formal education.
Yeah, definitely. I know that kind of formal sport can be a bit of a barrier as well, a bit off-putting if there's not a connection there with the school. And I remember previous life did a lot of work around satellite clubs or sending a friendly face from the club into the school to make that connection, which sometimes it can be a bit daunting.
And it works both ways, of course, because those community groups are looking for new participants. The schools have all the children there. So whether or not it's an active thing, as it sounds there, come for a taster or a trial, or whether it's more of a referral, which is for children with maybe behavioural difficulties or health issues, actually those sorts of referrals can also be incredibly effective.
Moving on from school, you mentioned university there, what was your kind of sport in? Because oftentimes people go to university, they throw themselves into the university unions, etc., get involved in a lot of new sports and meet new people. Was that your experience, or was it slightly different? I'm interested with that, what we're talking about in terms of participation and girls continuing to be involved. Was that your experience, or was it slightly different?
No, I was lucky. It was absolutely my experience. Now, again, whether that was university or whether that was just because that's what I enjoyed doing. But, I played all sorts of tennis, lacrosse, water skiing for some reason, squash, badminton. So I got involved in lots of different clubs, and it really did form a lot of my university period of time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So much so that when I got to the end of my university, I did a degree in English and history and had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do, as I'm sure many students do. In fact, with fees these days, maybe less than when I was at university, where you really didn't need to think about what.
Yeah, it focuses the mind a bit more, the fees this time, yeah.
I imagine, but I'd had two sort of awful holiday jobs, one working in a factory, one doing paper filing for Reading Council.
That's a classic student summer jobs here.
Exactly right. Very nice, paying your rent, etc. But actually put me off work. I just thought, oh my goodness, if this is the world of work, then I don't want to do it. So I chose to do an MA in sport and leisure management, because I thought, right, that's the thing I feel passionate about. That's the thing that I would like to do. The slight irony is that I've then spent most of my professional career in an office jobs, but jobs that I really love.
Yeah, in terms of that sport and leisure management, where did that take you? So was that with a view to get into, I guess the sporting arena, but did you think of it as a delivery role you were looking at? I know you didn't go to that initially, but was that the idea of taking on the MA?
I think, like many people, I didn't understand the sector. So yes, I think I only knew that there were delivery roles. I sort of could see myself being a sports teacher or running a leisure centre or doing something like that. Actually, as it was, the course that I was on was slightly more focused around the sort of burgeoning leisure sector. So things like theme parks and country parks, things like that. And I ended up getting a placement at Alton Towers, which made me incredibly popular with my friends because I could take them to the front of the ride. But my role there was in marketing, and that introduced me. I did a placement as part of my MA and was then given a full-time job. And that really changed my mind on office work. And actually, I was reflecting on it, which was, for a marketeer, it was an absolute heaven. I could run a campaign. At the time, I was responsible for getting coach loads of employees or school kids to come to the theme park. And you could run a campaign, and then you could literally see the park fill up with people. So that sort of immediacy of doing some work and seeing whether it worked or not, I think has sort of carried me through ever since. Really.
Yeah, definitely. You can see them all turning up with their coupons out of the paper or whatever it is. Yeah,
exactly,
get some discount. Right. Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, obviously that commercial marketing, do you think you've been able to carry that through into your current role? That kind of, I guess we'll probably get into that in terms of what Sported are actually doing and supporting the organisations with. But that marketing angle, that commercial is commercial now. So you think you brought that into your current role?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think, like any CEO, actually one of the challenges and opportunities is that you do need to be a bit of a jack of all trades, and the ability to be able to look and support groups in the different departments within your organisation. But certainly in the last year, Sported has done a lot of work on trying to refine how it communicates what we do, developing more commercial partnerships with other parties, revamping our website, looking at our social media. Charity is not unlike any corporate organisation in terms of needing to be able to articulate what it does to its stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll pick up on that later on. I think definitely you're doing such a vast amount and support. I'm assuming that'll be a challenge day to day, so we'll probably pick up on that communication piece there. And I've seen some of the campaigns like the recent one with Eric Dyer, etc. So it's definitely getting out there. In terms of Sported, and I did want to pick up on one of your previous roles, but I think I'll leave it for a later question. In terms of Sported, are you able to just outline kind of the origins? I know obviously came off Sir Keith Mills, his initial baby, I suppose you'd say, but in terms of that, could you outline that for the listeners just so they get a good understanding of the organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very much Sir Keith Mills' baby. Sir Keith helped us win the London 2012 Olympics. And back in 2008, when he was successful in doing so, they made a personal commitment to inspiring the youth to become more physically fit. Keith had a look round at the sector and actually came to the opinion that the infrastructure was already in place, that there were already thousands of community groups doing amazing work in their environments. And it was through those community groups that was the best channel to get young people active. But those community groups themselves just weren't being given the support they needed. So Sported was set up by Keith to offer free professional services to those organisations to help with their resilience and sustainability. Sported's view then and now is that actually they are best placed to understand their communities and the issues within their communities. They're best placed to interact with their young people and to support them. But those sorts of skills aren't necessarily, or those types of people and volunteers often don't have the time or even necessarily the capability to run an organisation. And those organisations becoming ever more complex. So Sported provide the free professional support, business planning, marketing, to really help those organisations.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of, especially nowadays, the situation at the moment, is funding and grant funding and things like that, is that a part of what you do, or is that, I know previously it might have been, but is that currently how
It's a massive part of what we do. Regrettably, I'd like to say that it's only a problem during COVID, but funding is a perennial problem for community groups. As I say, they're set up with an enormous amount of passion. And then actually when the implications of running a group, of needing volunteers, of needing good safeguarding, of needing good governance, of needing new equipment, of needing to insure your business, etc., that requires people and requires funding. And often people running these sorts of groups don't have contacts because we tend to focus on groups that are in areas of deprivation. They don't know someone that can just fundraise for them or give them access to a local corporate who could sponsor the group or whatever it may be. So Sported's job is very much to support that.
So how does that work in practice? So do you kind of bridge the gap between that? So bring the let's say the local corporate or the corporate who wants to get involved in the community, do you bring those two together? Is that how?
Yeah, so originally when Sported was set up, we did issue grants ourselves. But actually, Sported was always a relatively minor donor. There are some huge organisations, both trusts and foundations, statutory bodies, national governing bodies, corporates who will make funding available. So what we try to do is be the connection between the two, which is that we do two things. We inform all of our groups of funding that's available in their regional area and in accordance with the sorts of delivery they're giving, i.e. we highlight those funds that would be applicable for them, and then we also help them with funding applications as well. One of the challenges for these groups is in order to get funding, you need to be able to evidence the impact that you're having in your community. And that can be something that you've not come across. How do I articulate what it is that I do for my local community? I can see it makes a huge difference to those kids that turn up on a Saturday morning. But how do I put that down on pen and paper in a way that a funder will feel comfortable about that? So our role is to get them fit for funding, to help with the funding application, and then to connect them through to funders.
And in terms of you centrally, because it sounds like a massive job that you're undertaking, because like you said, 2,600 organisations. How is Sported funded? If that was maybe a silly question.
Yeah,
how do you fund yourselves at the top end? Yeah.
No, it's a great question. And we likewise need to be a sustainable organisation because we provide our services free of charge to our members. We keep reviewing this and we keep feeling that's the right thing to do, that our members are not the people that are able to fund our ongoing operations. They need our help. So we likewise are looking for partners to help fund us. We do get quite a lot of help from national government in all of the 4 regions that we operate in, and we do work with corporates and trusts and foundations. We tend to position ourselves as being the access through from those larger organisations that genuinely want to do good and understand that a local place-based operation can be very effective, but don't have a connection through. So that's our role, to identify those groups that would best benefit from funding and to help distribute that.
Yeah, definitely. So the membership for an organisation, if they wanted to get involved, absolutely free. They just sign up. Is that how it tends to work for them?
Absolutely free. So for us, the only really criteria is that the organisation must have some form of a social purpose. So if you're a traditional football group or tennis group or whatever it might be, and it's just about the playing and winning the leagues, then that isn't the right organisation for Sported. But if at the heart of your organisation, it's about creating positive social change, that may be through inclusion. For example, you may start to a women and girls programme. It may be because you're tackling antisocial behaviour in your area. It could be that you're trying to help with education, employability. There's a number of different social outcomes, but that is what drives your organisation. And that's really the reason that Sported will support you.
And the underlying is obviously they need to be around sport, right? So it couldn't just be a local recruit.
Yes,
is that expanded? I was going to say, is that something you'd maybe look to go deeper with, or why did cast the net wider in the future?
Great question. So most of our groups are not members of their national governing body. They don't just offer one sport. In fact, over half are multi-sports organisations. Their view is that they will use whatever sport helps them achieve their social purpose. So, whether it's roller skating or yoga or dancing or football or whatever it might be. One of the wonderful things you mentioned about the Sunday Times campaign and Eric Dyer is that the Sunday Times picked up on sports that weren't traditional sports, just to show the sheer variety of physical activity options that there are out there.
And just final question in terms of operationally, what's the structure in terms of how this is all delivered? Because so much on offer and supporting so many organisations.
So the model of Sported is that we have 40 staff, around 10 of which are based in sort of central functions. So where there is informational services that we can provide centrally and distribute regionally. About 30 are regional staff, so very much based in the areas with which the groups are in. Despite COVID and the ability to use digital technology, there is still a real role for knowing the local community, making local connections into local authorities, local schools, and really going to see members and sit with them face to face. And then in addition, and I think there's a really important addition to what Sported does, we have skilled volunteers. So these are individuals who wish to give back, but wish to really capitalise on their own professional skills. I think much of volunteering is seen as relatively manual. And actually, what we're doing is we're harnessing the skills and experience that our volunteers have and then matching them with groups that need those skills. So as I mentioned, this whole aspect of getting them funding ready, you need to have a business plan. You need to be able to show your finances in a comprehensive Excel spreadsheet. And we've got volunteers for whom that's their bread and butter, and they're able to come in and set up the right systems and come up with the right processes for those organisations to then run.
Definitely. So business people, accountants, anyone who's interested, who wants to give back, then there's an opportunity for them there to contribute.
Yeah, and it tends to be either financial services or actually marketing. So as a lot of groups have looked at how they recruit new members, what they do on social media, whether they want to set up a website, there's also quite a lot around marketing.
Fantastic. So just stepping back, I'm really interested in this. So I know prior to you've always Sported or in previous roles, you actually worked with a company delivering loyalty schemes. So the Nectar, is it the Nectar card or was it Club card?
Yeah. So, all of them, actually.
All of them,
yes.
Right, so fantastic.
Yeah, I worked at Air Miles, which then became Avios, and Tesco and Nectar. So, yeah, spent over 20 years working in the world of a loyalty program.
Fantastic. Look, I mean, from our point of view, obviously we're software business and heavily interested in tech, and that data, I know the data you'd receive from a loyalty scheme is extremely valuable, or can give you those kind of insights into how to deploy resources. Is that something that you've ever looked at? It's maybe difficult across the voluntary sector, but that kind of having that data, is that something you're looking at the moment, or a strategy for the future for Sported?
Yeah, and you're right, by the way, in terms of those loyalty programs. Certainly when I got into loyalty 20 years ago, it was paper vouchers and it was just about incentives to get people to shop with you. And that has utterly transitioned through now to very sophisticated data organizations who understand what customers buy and are they therefore able to give much more personalized offers to them. The charity sector is different, not because I don't think that the data is as important, it absolutely is, but certainly my experience of Sported has been that it's more difficult to automate the collection of that data. So when a member joins Sported, we will take some basic information from them in terms of what their social outcome is, clearly where their postcode is, audiences they're targeting, and we can use that to make sure that our communication is more personalized. But that information is then manually updated, so it's just a bit more difficult. So I think there are two aspects to data within a charity sector. The first of which for us is how can we use what we know to offer more personalized services? If I'm a group and I'm just setting up, I need completely different resources than if I'm a group that's looking to grow or diversify. And so we need to get better ourselves at offering products and services directly geared. I think we've also been able to identify where there are groups that need our help. So we recently did some work during the pandemic of those groups in London that were in the bottom 10% areas of deprivation who hadn't received funding as far as we could see from any areas, so that we could really then target in on those groups most specifically needing our help. And I think we're starting to make better progress in that area. The other part, though, is around measurements, which I mentioned in terms of a club being able to prove the impact and effectiveness.
Evidence in that impact. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and actually that one for me has remained difficult because there are technologies, there are booking platforms that enable you to track which of your young people are coming to your group. And clearly questionnaires and surveys where you can look at their mental and physical well-being. It's very difficult. If you're running a group in a local area and you're trying to build up the trust of individuals who don't want to give personal data, and where you're trying to get inactive children to come and participate, you don't want to put all the barriers of long registration forms, etc.
Yeah, especially in that informal setting. Try and connect.
So there's a real balance between, on the one hand, creating a welcoming, safe and open environment, and on the other hand, collecting the data that ultimately we'd all like, because A, it would help the group, and B, it would help the sector. And I think I've just become more realistic about what's feasible as opposed to what's ideal.
And in terms of ourselves as a business, we use something we call like a North Star metric, essentially. So it's like what this one metric that shows the impact that we're making, and for us it's daily active sessions through our platform. I was wondering, when you said about being able to, it's kind of, I guess, two levels, being able to measure the impact of, for the grassroots organisation, for them to impact, but also for you to be able to evidence all the work you're doing across the board. A lot of it maybe not really data driven, is it? It's like maybe soft skills, someone visiting and maybe mentoring, supporting. Do you have a way of I guess presenting that information or tracking it, or just, I'm just curious in terms of
and Sported did used to have its own measurement tool that we used, but we've actually stopped using that because our personal view now is that we need to create more consistency across the sector. I think part of the problem for these organisations, and in fact for the whole sector, is there are so many different measurement tools and so many different KPIs at it, and for each of the funders, the funder will there also stipulate what type of metrics they need. And if there was a magic wand that I could wave and change one thing, it would be that like you, we had one central metric that all groups knew that they had to measure, because that would then answer any questions that were.
It covers a lot. Yeah, it covers a lot. I think with yours as well, it could be anything, because you're getting so many, you've got the volunteer hours that people are putting into an organisation, plus obviously funding and attendance and all
and
that.
Also for Sported, we're measuring two things. So we ourselves are measuring the resilience and sustainability of the group. For us, that's what success looks like. It's all about making sure that organisation is fit for purpose. It's kind of a put your oxygen mask on first approach, which is, if the organisation is strong and the resources are there and there's good training and a good culture, then that's going to be the right place for young people to come. But ultimately, we're only doing that because we want the same opportunities for all young people across the UK. And particularly in areas of deprivation or some other minority groups, it's difficult for them to access the same level of sporting facilities than it is for others.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I guess moving away from data and then the impact, etc., what would you say, just I guess operationally, it's probably a different challenge over the last year or so, but prior to that, what would you say the kind of recurring challenges you'd face as in your role or as the organisation as a whole?
I think it's about scalability, actually, which is where you have that connection. It's not a quick fix. It's based on trust. Everybody is generally putting in volunteer hours. So whether it's the people running the groups, the vast majority of our groups are run by volunteers. Our own skilled volunteers are giving of their own time. So actually things can take a little while to implement. And we already have 2,600 groups, which makes us the largest network within the UK. But we think that there's probably somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 community groups doing great work. And that just isn't being covered by anyone at scale. So then you get into the debate about whether or not it's best to deliver services on an interpersonal face-to-face basis, at which point it is very resource intensive, but it's also very local, very practical, very helpful, or to what extent you can scale that through more central services. So I think for us, we're constantly playing that balance between scale, and we would love to help more groups, and delivery and the personalization of that delivery, and how we can find a happy medium between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're talking on Zoom now. It's probably, I don't know if it's something you thought of prior to COVID. I'm sure you've been doing a lot of video comms like everyone. Do you think that's something that's going to play a part in kind of the evolution of sports in moving forward, like more remote?
I think
remote
if you'd asked me
support?
a few weeks ago, I might have been more optimistic about that. But we've just done some research into the sort of the digital skills of our members, because we've very much been looking at what resources could we put online, how can we help our groups with their communication challenges. During COVID, that's been massive, which is that our members have been desperate to stay in touch with their young people. And of course, in the olden days, when young people came to their groups, again, that was all very much face-to-face. It was all about that personal interaction. And our group leaders themselves have had to transition through to more digital interactions for welfare, giving them online challenges, just keeping them engaged. And the research that we've just conducted actually shows that the level of basic technical and digital skills is much lower than we had anticipated. And that actually things like just using digital communications, about 50% of our groups don't have websites. So trying to think through how to help with those basic skills. And so now I think our nervousness is around actually the more that things become digital in delivery, the more that divide gets worse. So actually it could harm the very thing that we're trying to resolve, which is to support those groups that don't have the resources and aren't set up for that sort of operation.
Yeah, do you think that's a resource issue, or is it more like, let's say, is it the leadership in terms of maybe they're not as computer literate, digitally literate, or is it more just the resources and the time that it takes to set up a website, keep it maintained, etc.?
I think there's a bit about resources, but actually it's more basic than that. For some of our members, when we research them, they don't have broadband, or they don't have the right,
Connection. Yeah, of course.
We've heard about it, certainly when we hear about school children not being able to do their work and falling behind in COVID. And I think that's also true of some of our group leaders. They just aren't the sort of people that got involved in sports volunteering and helping their community so they could spend more time at their computer. That's not the way they work. So I definitely think there's something about resources, which is generally linked to poverty. And I then also think there's an element related to skills. What Sported would like to do clearly is to help with that skills piece. So how can we encourage more people to use technology to harness its power? But I think our starting point for that is much lower than I thought our starting point would be. So I wanted to get involved in open data initiatives and how we could link our groups through to booking platforms or social prescribing activities. And actually, I've come back from that to think that the base requirement
Foundations first,
that everyone has the foundation.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it definitely sounds like a good CSR opportunity for one of the mobile networks to put some money into sport.
If you know anyone, I'd be delighted.
I mean, in terms of, I think it's elephant in the room we've been talking about, but I'd say COVID and the impact it's having, and I'm sure that you've got some insight to share in terms of what that's meant to some of your organisations that you're working with, and the main challenges. I know we recently had a conversation on a previous episode with Jason from Greenhouse Sports. He was talking about just the way that actual physical and mental health of their children and young people coming back in was really shocking at first to see back in September or after the first lockdown. Does that translate across? Obviously, you're seeing a wider picture of the whole country. Does that translate across all what you're seeing as well?
Certainly when COVID first hit, we were really worried about the survival of groups. So we already had figures that said that a quarter of our groups weren't sure that they would be in existence in 6 months' time. And so we felt that the lack of subs coming in and the inability to have any sort of trading would really affect our groups. What's interesting is that after lockdown 1, I think most groups have realized that they have been able to mothball relatively well. So the irony is the smaller the groups, the easier it was to mothball because they don't have their own facilities, because they don't have their own staff. So actually less than 10% groups now are saying that they think that they'll fail as a result of COVID. The second point, though, which is more to the comment from Greenhouse, was that the fitness and well-being of young people is a real concern to the group. And so that has remained their number one concern. We've done over 900 surveys with our members since COVID started a year ago now. And throughout that, consistently, the number one concern has been the well-being of their young people and how they can stay in contact and how they can maintain their mental and their physical fitness. But then when we saw the sort of reprieve over last summer and autumn, actually returning to play wasn't that easy, which is when you don't have cash, then having to hire your sports hall or the facility or the football pitch or whatever for the first time requires cash. Because of social distancing, you need volunteers, because you need more coaches, because you need to keep the kids from distant from each other. You need more equipment because you're trying to reduce the amount of handling from one to another. So the challenge of reopening was really quite significant. And about a third of our groups didn't reopen during that period because they were nervous. So I think as we look now really positively towards this spring and the opportunity for our groups to reopen, I think that's when the work really, really starts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that because I guess maybe it's just anecdotally, but hearing from I guess the commercial sector, sports side of things, children's sport activity providers, that kind of reopening and that pent up demand is meant that it's really positive for them that we're back open and everyone's flooding back. And I guess that's just what you said there puts it into perspective. If you've got the funds, then it is really easy to get back. And obviously they're catering for maybe a different demographic, but the deprivation.
And I think our group leaders aren't as confident as you're saying there. I think they're nervous that young people have got out of the habit of coming. I mean, we all know that sport is a habit, and that once you're into that sort of routine, that it's easier then to continue. And clearly, there's been a massive break in that area. So there's certainly a lot of requests that we're getting around marketing, around how to contact new participants, etc. I do think that the statutory bodies and the national governing bodies have been very supportive, and there have actually been quite considerable government funds coming through to help groups. So quite a lot of groups are now sitting on funds that will enable them to have that seed funding to get back up and going. But I don't think it should be underestimated in any level that they'll just open their doors, everyone will flood back in, and life will be hunky-dory.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the support that's available, and I guess my question was going to be around what support do you think is required coming out of this? I'm sure there's been various funds. Recently, Sport England announced a fund for the youth opening up the secondary schools or school facilities, things like that. In terms of the support needed, maybe not even financial, but what do you think is needed for the grassroots organisations over the next 12 months to kind of help them get back to where they were or grow again?
Well, I think the first thing is more of a voice, which is our belief is that it is the group leaders in their local environments that know what help is required. And actually, as a group, they aren't necessarily well represented when decisions are made about sport. So you've got sort of the private or the public leisure centres who I think have quite a strong voice. I think you've got the national governing bodies who again have got quite a strong voice. But because of the fragmentation of these thousands of groups, it's difficult for them to have the same level of influence of government as some of those other sectors have had. I do think it's about resource. I think this whole sector is sort of manages on a shoestring. Most of our groups operate on less than £10,000 a year and yet do significantly wonderful job for the young.
So do you think that's taken for granted then, from obviously the impact there's thousands of organisations doing, I won't say the majority of the impact, but maybe if they haven't got the voice, are they taken for granted, do you think?
I think they were taken for granted. One of the upsides, maybe one of the only upsides, one of the upsides of COVID is that people have missed community sport. I think parents have realised the impact that community sport has on their children's well-being. So I think there is more of an understanding of the community, social and medical benefits of community sport.
More of a personal question now. In terms of your, obviously your history in business and leading organisations, etc. What do you think? Have you developed any kind of philosophies or any approaches to managing a large organisation now, a lot of members, a lot of moving parts? What do you think? Have you got anything that you always implement?
Well, going back to those sort of university days in terms of what do you want to be when you grow up, I think I always struggled with that singular answer. And I think I had a relatively traditional view of work, which was you got a job and you stuck with that job. And actually what I've loved, whilst mostly within the domain of loyalty and data areas, is that I've been a bit of a generalist. So I've done sales jobs, marketing jobs, strategy jobs, research jobs, operational jobs. And through each of those areas, I've learned skills, which now now beautifully come together, I think, once you're running an operation, because as I say, you need to understand each of those departments. So for me, I think I would have said as a younger person that being a generalist was a bit of a disadvantage, i.e. that I never quite found that specialism that I wanted to stick out and become an expert at. Actually, I think as you become more senior, having more experience of different disciplines actually helps you take a much more holistic approach to an organization.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think you can help you delegate as well, right? Because you know a little bit about each subject, so you can know that I'm not going to be able to get this done myself, but I'll know if they've done a good job or not.
Yeah.
And also, I was just thinking that it does help you. I'm assuming help you relate with those grassroots organisations where the person running it is essentially in that startup mindset, doing everything.
You're exactly right. They're a generalist, aren't they? Yeah, and I think that was another thing for me. I've worked for quite a lot of startups, some of which have then gone on to be quite large organizations. And there's always a challenge, which is more difficult to work in a startup where you've got to do a bit of everything, or to work in a more complex, large organization and, you know, all of the issues around that. But for me, I've always enjoyed the immediacy of a startup or a small organization because of that ability to see across all of the different disciplines.
In terms of your opinion, what do you think's the key to leading a successful business or leading a successful organization?
I do think two things, one of which is people. There is absolutely no question in my mind that good people make all the difference. But I do think that those good people also need to have a clear sense of direction and a clear ability to pull together. So I think good people don't necessarily deliver good things if everyone's not sure of what they're trying to do. So those two things for me: direction and good people.
Definitely get that vision statement written then for everyone. Yeah.
Funnily enough, that's what we're working on at the moment, which is probably why it's a bit close to my heart.
Yeah. In terms of your on that as well, obviously leading the organisation, there's so many moving parts, etc. Is communication a challenge then? With, I don't know, because you've got such a team of volunteers.
Yeah.
And obviously employment is a slightly different relationship. Obviously, if you've got a volunteer giving their time for free, is that a challenge to manage that? Getting a question correct there, but do you understand what I mean in terms of
I absolutely get it. And actually, I joined Sported 2 years ago, and at that point there were already very good infrastructure in place for good communication, which has held us in fantastic stead when COVID hit. Suddenly, everyone was working from home and worrying about how they were going to set up meetings and Zoom calls and all the rest of it. And Sported was so used to working in that way because we've always had a UK-wide distribution of team members. We're always used to working with volunteers on a tool that works for them. So actually, we were very, very well set up for that distributed communication.
And what does the future look like in terms of your plans going forward for Sported? Is it very? I've talked about a lot of it, but is it very much kind of growing the membership base, and or have you got any other areas that you're looking to move into?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a real desire to see some consolidation. Actually, I think as a sector, my biggest observation when I came in was just how fragmented the sector were. The Sport for Development Coalition, which has been set up, is a great initiative. There are over 160 members. So there are a lot of organisations trying to do really good work within the sport for development sector. I'd like to see us work much more closely together. I think we'd be more impactful. Likewise, as I mentioned, we've got 2,600 groups. There are many, many more, giving those organisations a voice and an ability to work together. So at the moment, it tends to be a bit of a parent-child relationship with Sported, in that we'll help each member individually. What we'd ideally like to see is those members come together to be able to co-create solutions and work better together. And then I also think that there's a huge gap between grassroots sport and club sport or elite sport. There's no obvious pathway through which, from a opportunities perspective, we get our young people into grassroots sports. They learn all these amazing skills, sports skills, volunteering skills, leadership skills, and then there's no obvious pathway through. So I think the sector coming together in a more consolidated way is something that I would love to see happen to the sector, and I would like Sported to be part of that transition.
Fantastic. And so I've got a query on I know you said that, I guess, the total amount of organisations in the country, you mentioned, was it 150,000?
Yeah.
Is that, in terms of those, what would be the classification? So would they anything from a sports club with obviously with that remit for community development? Is that all the way to just a youth organisation that's not built around sport?
Sport in some way to help it, yes.
Right.
And the trouble is, James, there isn't a really tight definition on this. So how many of those 150,000 have a sport for social good agenda, or how many of them have a sport agenda? There really hasn't been a proper piece of work defining that, I always think of it as a bit of an iceberg, which is that we're dealing at the top of the iceberg and we can see clearly what's at the top of the iceberg. But actually, I think there's a whole swathe of work going on under the surface of the ocean.
Yeah, definitely. And even ones that might not use sport at the moment, but it could be a really huge driver for them if they did implement a sports program or something in there.
Absolutely right. But I think the fact that the sector has been built on volunteering, that many of these groups are organised by volunteers, has meant that there hasn't necessarily been that professionalism around trying to identify them, trying to give them centralised resource. So there is something about just trying to understand the sector before we can then really help support them.
Definitely. And this is one I always ask everyone, because I'm just curious in terms of, it might be different now, obviously, being cooped up in the house for the last 3 months or so. But what's your daily routine look like? Do you have any specific habits that you do every day? Or
it is so massively different though. I can never quite decide when I'm lying in bed at 7 o'clock whether or not I'm delighted that there's a lockdown and that I'm not currently on a commuter train up to London, or whether actually it's just a delight to be able to get up slightly more slowly, go for a quick walk before breakfast, etc. I think so my day, I'm afraid, is slightly uninspiring in terms of literally getting up, having breakfast, going for a small walk and then working all the way through. I have though really tried to make sure that I take a break during the day. The daylight for me is really important.
It's so easy to just sit at the desk all day. Right?
Yeah, and so I think that has been a big change, which is trying to carve out an hour at lunchtime to get out and just get some fresh air.
Get some fresh air, yeah, for sure. And I'm the same. For some reason, I'm just waking up an hour later than I used to, and I don't know why. So maybe that's it. No matter how many alarms I put on, it's just
I've had more sleep in the last year than I think I've had in the previous 20.
Brilliant. What about, I guess, personal development, learning, books, things like that? Is there any books that you normally, I guess a question I normally ask is a book that you would gift, if you could give someone a book, or if you could give someone a book to read, what would it be?
Wow.
Don't know if I've caught you off guard there. So.
I think you have caught me off guard. I have to say I'm not very good at reading management books. Not
unless you want to go to sleep. Maybe
caught me off guard on that one. It'll definitely be a novel though.
Yeah, no problem. And final question we normally ask is, if you could go back in time, so we go back to before you started your career, maybe just as you're embarking in on towers, maybe just leaving university, etc. Is there any piece of advice you'd go back and maybe give yourself as you started out?
Yeah, I think it really would be enjoy what you do. So making sure that you work for a sector or for an organisation that you enjoy, and don't be scared of being a generalist. I think I wish someone had said that to me earlier, because the key component for me now is to make sure that I'm learning something new every single day or every single week. And I think as long as you're doing that, and it doesn't actually matter whether that's in work or out of work, there's all sorts of different ways in which you can continue to learn. That would be my advice, because as you say yourself, James, at a certain point that all seems to come together, and all of that knowledge that you've gained over doing different things at different times, many of which are linear as opposed to, hierarchical, I think really come to fruition.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it makes you more appealing, more attractive to any employer as well, doesn't it? If you can jump in and get involved at any level. So I really appreciate that. Nicola, thanks so much for your time. It's been great. And if anyone wants to get involved with Sported from both sides, so we've got the potential CSR partners or organisations, we will link everything into the show notes. But is there anything you wanted to? Brilliant.
And yes, and if there are members out there, groups that are struggling at the moment, that need some help, that have listened to what I've said, that we deliver and are interested, we're bringing on new members all the time. So please just go to our website. You can get hold of us there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Nicola. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, James.
Cheers. Yeah. Thank you for listening to this week's show. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at dryphase.podcast@coordinate.cloud, tweet us at coordinatesport, or follow us on Instagram at coordinate_sports, or on my account at James_ventures. This episode was produced by Nancy Kwamboka, with support from Claire Goodchild and Lola Small, with special thanks to Rochelle. I'm James Moore, and you've been listening to The Drive Phase from Coordinate Sport.